I'd like to call this meeting to order. The time is 9:12. Thank you for your patience this morning. Today is Friday, October 15th, 2021, and this is a one-day meeting of the Physical Therapy Board of California. Today we're meeting virtually by WebEx. This is an official business meeting of the Physical Therapy Board of California. The board's role during the pandemic continues to be to maintain consumer protection and consult with local and state entities on the laws and regulations pertaining to the physical therapy industry. I'd also like to explain how this meeting will be conducted. We do have a moderator from the Department of Consumer Affairs online to help us today. Individuals listening to the meeting will have an opportunity to provide public comment and will be assisted by a moderator who will be facilitating the teleconferencing process. We will take public comment on specific agenda items, and at both the beginning and the end of the meeting, there will be a comment session for items not on the agenda. Public comments must be specific to the agenda item that's being discussed. If you make a comment during a specific agenda item that is not related to that topic, you will be placed on mute by the moderator. All comments that do not directly relate to an item on the agenda should be held until the agenda item for items not on the agenda. The board follows the Open Meeting Act, so while we accept and appreciate the public's comments, we cannot respond to those comments. For those members of the public participating via teleconference, please wait until the moderator has introduced you before you make your comment. The moderator will give instructions on how to participate at each opportunity for public comment. This meeting is being recorded and the minutes of the meeting will be prepared. Can we please have roll call?
Alicia Benamen here. Katarina Ellaby.
Present.
Dale Armstrong. Jesus Dominguez.
Present.
Daniel Drummer. Jonathan Irvin. Jonathan Irvin is absent. Tanya McMillian.
Present.
All members are present with the exception of Jonathan Irvin, and the board has a quorum.
Thank you. And agenda item number 3 is the reading of the board's mission statement. I'd like to ask public member, Ms. Carmen, to please read the mission statement.
To advance and protect the interests of the people of California by the effective administration of the Physical Therapy Practice Act.
Thank you, Ms. McMillian. And agenda item number 4 is public comment on items not on the agenda. So, moderator, can you please facilitate public comment for this agenda item?
Moderator, and at the direction of the board, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a public comment for items not on the agenda, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. We're currently sharing instructions on the screen for your reference, and in the Ask field, typically in the lower right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, please type comment or I would like to make a comment and send to all panelists. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, this is a moderator and it appears there are no requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please, thank you. Okay, we are going to move straight forward to agenda item number 5, but before we do that, I just want to give everyone present an idea of our schedule this morning. We do have some closed session items to discuss. That's agenda item number 9, and I would like to take that at 11:30. So we'll probably take a short break, a short recess right before that, and then start discussing the case at 11:30. My guess is that we'll then go into lunch for an hour after that. So my best guess is that we will be back on record probably around 1:30 to finish out the afternoon on the sunset issue. So that is the schedule for this morning, and we will go right into agenda item number 5.
So I will take that one.
This is a working meeting, our first working meeting towards our next sunset report that we will be presenting before the legislature the early part of 2022. And so I have a number of members who are familiar with sunset and have participated in the past, but we do have a few new members. So we provided some basic information through the briefing paper to kind of describe what sunset is, some expectations of timelines, and some to-do items that the board has. So the first thing I think for point of discussion amongst the members would be with a somewhat truncated timeline compared to what we're used to, how would the board like to go about preparing this report? And we've given a couple of examples of, delegating certain things to staff, what have you, or creating a committee of 2 members to assist staff in the drafting of the report. We provided you the new this year's sunset template of questions, and you can see it's pretty familiar with what we've seen in the past. There are a few new items, some COVID-related questions, those kind of things. I think that this is going to be pretty easy for us to sew together. In fact, we're going to show you a draft with some of the data kind of plugged in. Just keep in mind that it is draft. It's as much as we could collect as, since we've received the template. But it will be our working document. If the other consideration in whether or not we're going to delegate to staff or comprise a committee, one of the things that I'd like you to consider is who is actually going to be presenting before the legislature. A thing to keep in mind is that we do have our elections coming in December. And, that does have some bearing on who would be presenting early in 2022. So kind of keep that in mind. We also have our delegate responsibilities for FSBPT that are kind of, key. And I'd also like to make sure that in that presentation to the legislature, we have 1 professional member and 1 public member also, just for that balance of presentation. So I'm eager to hear from you as members, through conversation, what you would like to see moving forward. If you were to ask me for a recommendation of any kind, I would probably recommend a committee. And I only say that because of the truncated time. We're only going to have these kind of really quick, 1-day, most likely WebEx style meetings. And so the sunset process itself is a little abbreviated. It's not the big monumental sunset process that we were familiar with 5 years ago.
So 5 years ago, the entire board was the committee.
No, we did have 2 members of the committee that we worked with, but we were able to convene more in-person meetings to work as a whole board and try to author the report. And we still have that opportunity here. It's just a lot less frequently and a lot less volume of time.
I think I'm just trying to compartmentalize and title what we were. I thought that the board was the committee, and then the 2 who testified were like a subcommittee. I don't know. That
was the committee, right? So the 2 that testified also assisted outside of the board meetings with staff and kind of formulating draft language to bring back to that larger board meeting, those working sessions that we had. But really, those meetings, the only thing we did was sunset business, right? And then we had our normally scheduled quarterly board meetings in between as well.
Okay.
This is Daniel. In reviewing the list of information in the packet, just reviewing that, it seems that the information is a little bit different this time. It seems a lot more really just reporting of data more than last time we did I felt like we did a bigger dive into what the board is, what the board is for, more conceptual kinds of stuff, where this time it seems like the questions are really a lot more just about reporting data that's been collected. Is that right? Or am I not remembering correctly?
You're right and remembering incorrectly. So, and I say that because the template that we drafted our last report on was very similar to the template that you see before you today. As you can see, like the first couple questions of this template ask for like a historical and a background about the board, in which case we wrote a pretty lengthy section of language describing what it is, why we do it. And we continue to use some of the same language from sunsets prior, right? I mean, the history of the board is the history of the board, and there's only so many ways that you can kind of rewrite it each time for this sunset presentation. But I will tell you that in the last couple legislative sessions, and part of this partly might be driven by COVID and prioritization, sunset not being as high of a priority because the legislature is dealing with more emergent situations like COVID and the pandemic, that as I've attended sunset hearings for boards over the last legislative session and the session before that, they are really more interested in the issues and the issues only. And some of those issues are, driven in the data, right? And so when we came in, we were able to have this kind of very open introduction. We gave them a brief history. We walked them through the composition of the board, how many licenses we have, what are some of the difficulties the board has, all those different kind of things. Over the last couple sunset hearings, that's become less important. In fact, they've actually advised to kind of keep your opening statements to less than 5 minutes. Just a brief introduction, and let's go right into the issues that are identified. At this point in the process, we don't actually have issues identified from the legislature because we haven't even turned in our initial report yet. We have some carryover issues from the previous sunset that staff and I are going to be making as recommendations later in this conversation. But it is a little bit, I definitely agree with Dr. Drummer in the sense that we put in a lot of time and effort the last go-round, and this template doesn't really represent, that effort itself. And I think there's still going to be a lot of effort in this report. And like I said, the templates are very much the same, but the expectation of the legislature, the outcome of the report is a little bit different this year. In fact, I will go ahead and have the facilitator pull up the draft version of the report so you can get an idea of what it kind of looks like when we start plugging, documents in, data into the document. And keep in mind, this is just a draft. This is the working document. It is only text. It will have formatting issues. Some of the data is probably right on, but we want to double verify it before we move forward with it. So if you could scroll that page up a little bit. And so that section 1, I think, is the part that Daniel's he's talking about is how much data and how much meat we actually put into the last report. And we propose doing the same, right? I mean, we're going to take essentially what we reported at the last sunset, and we're just going to amend it with what's happened since then, instead of trying to rewrite the history of the board in just a different voice.
And thank you for that, Jason. I remember us spending a lot of time in creating a really big statement, or a number of big statements about where the board has been and where we've come from and where we are, and that took a great deal of time. And I did see some of those questions in the beginning of this report of what's required, or of the application, but it didn't seem, for some reason, it didn't carry the same weight as what we did the last time. And what I'm seeing now is the bulk of this really seems to be more about data that is presented by staff at our meetings, and it's collecting all of that.
And then I think in the last go-round, where the template was very similar, we did take each and every opportunity that we could in the report, present the data that they were asking for, and then also provide a narrative of what we were trying to identify as an issue, or what kind of assistance or help we would need from the legislature, whether it be, shortage of staffing, or shortage of, resources, or a fee increase, or expanding our statutory caps. My recommendation is to use a lot of that same content this time around, because I think it was good. We've made a lot of progress since that sunset report. Between sunset and our own strategic planning, and what we've been able to accomplish over the last 5 years, staffing is less of an issue than it was when we wrote this report originally. But a lot of the narrative that was provided in that previous report still applies to this template. That the history of the board, the function, and those kind of things are still things I think that we're going to have to include here.
And is this draft document that is partially on screen right now, do we have that yet or not? Do the board members? No, okay.
So as we go through this a little bit today, I'm only able to, I think, it might just be my learning curve. Yeah, I think I can figure it out now. Here we go. Moderator, do you know if I can advance the page from my control?
It's for you, the presenter role, which I can do.
Okay.
So the one that does not have an audio connection, is that your computer? Is that where you'll be controlling it from?
No, the one that I actually do have an audio connection from.
Okay. So I'll make that one the presenter. And then have you done this on WebEx before?
I have not.
Okay, so on the left side of your screen, there's like a vertical bar. And at the top of that vertical bar, there's like 4 squares in a cluster. If you click on that, it will show you the thumbnail view and you can click through the document that way.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So some of the narrative that Dr. Dunn was referring to, you'll see we've included in this draft, right? So in the first couple sections where it talks about the history, the occupations of the board licenses, those kind of things, we're using a lot of that same content from the last report because really nothing's changed in those regards. As we get to the data, some of this is still to be reported because we're still collecting this data as far as board members. But I will say that I think the board members are now familiar with, we've essentially tried to craft our agenda materials over the last 5 years with the idea of having those materials just kind of fill this report in, for ease of use. So when it comes to board member appointments and how we track them with all the data that we've collected over the last, 5 years through our quarterly meetings, it will now be very easy to kind of plug and play it into this sunset report. As well as the attendance of each board member, any of those kinds of questions that are addressed. Fund condition, again, from the presentation of the board materials, we're able to now take the data that we've prepared for you each and every quarterly meeting and just plug and play the fiscal years into this report. Keep in mind, this is still draft data, but it's very reliable. I just don't want anybody to, look at it too granularly. This is more for presentation's sake. One of the other things that we have in collaboration with the Department of Consumer Affairs and the Business and Professions Committee is come up with actual data sets that we can all agree that we rely on. And so the annual data report that the board puts out each year in conjunction with the Department of Consumer Affairs will be the source of data that we rely on to fill out the sunset report. And so it'll be very consistent and much easier to take the data from the annual report and just apply it here. Data is a very tricky thing when it comes to reporting. We can provide it in an annual report, but that report is just a capture in time, right? The data can reconcile differently, very shortly after that report is given. And so members might remember in the last sunset session, we had to explain why sometimes the data differed from the annual report, right? And we won't have to do that this time because we're relying solely on the annual report data. And so you see here, we're just providing the statistical data that they're asking for about the types of licenses issued, our performance measures when it comes to the issuance of a license, and as we move through these sections. I think the the parts that I'm going to need assistance with most from either the full board in its entirety, well, both the board in its entirety and if the board forms a committee, is kind of addressing some of the new questions that the legislature is interested in. And some of those things would be COVID related or SB 21 or AB 2138 related when it comes to the collection of demographic information or the collection of information on denials of people with criminal history. Because those are brand new topics, those are things that I think in collaboration with the committee, we'd be able to put something together and bring it back to the board at the November meeting. And then in a very kind of optimistic way, I'm hoping that we can actually complete and finish this sunset report in the 2-day December meeting and adopt it so that we can forward it on to the legislature as a complete report.
I'm not sure if it's my screen or if it's something with the presentation. I'm only seeing maybe the top 1/4 of each page as you've scrolled through things. I'm not seeing the entire page. And so I'm struggling with trying to just tease out the data that's being presented at this point. And
this is the moderator. There's two options we can do here. You can, for our board members, you can scroll over to the left-hand side on WebEx, and there should be a little bar that shows up. At the very bottom, there's a button that says Fit to Viewer, and that'll make it that you can see the whole page. And then for Jason, I'm going to have to try to remember where it is because I don't have the presenter rights right now, but I think if you go to View, and there should be an option that says synchronize my display. That'll synchronize it for everyone.
Also, just know if you do it to fit to page, it's going to shrink all the text. So if you'd like to leave it larger, Jason, you can just, once you click on the page, you can actually scroll the page and it will scroll for everybody else. It should anyway.
so this is Daniel. I did the Fit to Viewer and then it did make things incredibly tiny, but there is a zoom in and zoom out feature that are also on that vertical bar on the left. And I was able to zoom in so I can actually read the page now. I just have to use the scroll bar that's on the far right to be able to get through the entire page.
So the recommendation of staff and what I'm asking of the board at this point was, to establish a committee that we can then forward this draft on to and work with those two members to come up with a more working draft for the November meeting, right? Where all of the board members and also providing that draft well enough in advance for board members to review it and be prepared to discuss any kind of issues or topics they have at the actual November meeting. We've only had this template for, I would think it's probably been 30 days now. So compiling the data and putting it in right now is, like I said, in a very kind of raw draft form. And we haven't had the advantage or the opportunity to be able to discuss this with members until today. So I'm hoping we can get a couple of volunteers to serve as the committee. Hopefully those two folks are also going to be the people that, present to the legislature with the report itself. We can work with them back and forth over the next week or two, kind of polish this out a little bit more for presentation for the November meeting itself. Some of the other discussion points that I think that we can talk about today also, amongst the members is some of the issues that were identified in the last sunset report and how we might want to strategize moving forward with this report. Do we want to continue to include them? Are there any new issues that we want to identify? That kind of thing.
Jesus, if I may, just real quick. So my recollection is pretty similar to Daniel's. I think that when we did this as a full group, it was really after the committee, and my memory is not serving me very well, but I want to maybe say it was Alicia and TJ at the time. I honestly can't remember. But it seemed like when all of us convened up in DCA, we sort of had this, full energy of the board commitment where we were really spending a lot of time, to Daniel's point, crafting the message, sort of wordsmithing. And to me, it was helpful to have something, this sounds silly, but some clay already there so that the full committee could, sort of frame it in, in the light that we wanted to share with the legislature. So I would be in support of kind of what you suggested, a smaller committee that works with staff to get everything filled in. Because again, to Daniel's point, there's a lot of data that's being asked for, but there's also opportunities to craft a narrative. And I think the full board might be better used in crafting the narrative. But that's not to say I want to volunteer. I support it.
Thank you. Your recollection is correct, right? We had a lot more time. One of the things I don't know that if you recall, and we thought about presenting the old timeline compared to the new timeline, but for the sake of not trying to upset anybody involved, we didn't want to do that because it's such a clear night and day difference. The last time we went through sunset, this report was given to us, I want to say in early March. And we had a lot of, working sessions throughout the year where we actually had 2-day meetings with nothing on the agenda other than sunset. And, we had a lot of opportunity to work. This time around, not only is the prioritization different of the legislature and how sunset works, but obviously the timeline too. They've shown us essentially they want a more simplified process, a little bit less substance, and just really more the nuts and bolts of what a board needs, and what the sunset can decide, whether their existence is needed, and should they be extended and for how long, right? We're pretty blessed. We have a very non-controversial board. There's not a lot of, naysayers out there that are going to want to provide a lot of feedback that the PT board shouldn't exist or anything like that. In fact, we should have gone through this last year, but because of COVID-19, the legislature decided to extend us just for an additional year through emergency legislation, and now it's our turn. And like I said, in my opinion, two totally different processes now. Well, and, in comparison of each other, they're very distinctly different. So I don't know if Dr. Dominguez's agreement with my recommendation borderlines on a motion, but what do we think about a committee?
Well, this is Jesus, Jason. I'd be willing to put that motion forward. It makes sense, given our timeline, to have a smaller group of people working on it, and then the larger group can actually have something to work with that's not complete, but it's far enough along the path where it would really be just crafting the message at that point.
So a good way to do this is, with that being a motion, is one, to tackle it first, that yes, we are going to utilize the committee, get that voted on and get that ratified. And then the second step would be obviously to select who's going to serve on that committee. And I know how you guys love to do elections. So we have a motion from Dr. Dominguez to form a sunset committee to establish the report and work with staff.
I second it.
Okay, a motion from Dr. Dominguez and a second from Ms. McMillian. Any further board member comment or discussion? And moderator, can you please moderate or facilitate public comment?
Moderator, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access that Q&A panel and submit their requests. This is the moderator. It appears there are no requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. Okay. So we'll have a roll call vote, please.
Alicia Benet-Amen.
Aye.
Dale Armstrong.
Could
Jesus
we,
Dominguez. Oh, I'm sorry.
is it a question? I'm confused on what I'm responding to.
So there was a motion by Dr. Dominguez to form a committee to work with staff to establish the report on the sunset report.
I agree. Yes, I agree.
Okay.
Thank you. Jesus Dominguez. Daniel Drummer.
Aye.
Katarina Ellaby. Jonathan Irvin. Jonathan Irvin is absent. Tanya McMillian.
Aye.
Motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. So I think last sunset, it was Katarina and myself who served on the committee and presented to the joint committee. We would be happy to have any of you represent our board, and I would support that. So if there's anyone eager to jump in and give it a shot.
I'll jump in and give it a shot.
All right. Thank you, Tanya.
Alicia, this is Katarina. I just wanted to say to the other board members that it was a very good experience, and I definitely encourage them, if they haven't had the opportunity to present to the legislature, to take on that new experience, because it really was very eye-opening for me. So just wanted to state that.
I agree. Thank you for sharing that. I agree.
You know, one of the things that I'd add to it too is staff and I are going to try and make it very easy on the committee, right? A lot of this is kind of in-house data collection, and, you know, we're coming with recommendations to the board members, to the committee members, and the committee then obviously has the control in crafting that narrative, but we're going to try to do the majority of the work for you. So, you know, hopefully kind of like last time, there was always working product for you to kind of polish, not have to just kind of create out of thin air. So.
Tanya is one of our public members. Thank you for volunteering, Tanya. How about one of our licensed members? Anyone feel compelled to give this a go? Or maybe say why you would not want to give it a go, or that you don't have the bandwidth this time?
Or any questions you might have?
Yeah.
Alicia, this is Jesus. You've given me a lot of opportunity for bandwidth and wanting to, and not sure that I can. But so just so I'm clear, this conversation is in reference to the subcommittee, or in reference to presentation to the legislature? Which I would assume that probably the two folks that would agree to serve on the subcommittee are going to be the ones presenting.
So that is one of the questions. That is one of the questions that we brought up earlier. Is if that is the way the board wants to handle it. It doesn't. There's nothing set in stone, right? So you can have a committee, and you can have the presentation team, and they could be different people, right? but, you know, one of the recommendations that I would have is, obviously there's an advantage for the people who are serving on the committee. They're more familiar with the content. And if you are then sitting before the BMP committee and that questions are asked, those committee members are usually better prepared. So, but that's up to the board. That's the decision that you would be making is based on the presentation that you are going to make in front of the legislature. We've kind of established there's going to be a committee. We need to know who the committee is, and then is that synonymous? Is the committee also the presentation team? And I'm not necessarily saying it has to be, but that is the question that we're asking you to make today.
Yeah, and I mean, we really don't have to make that decision today, right?
That's true. You don't.
Yeah. So, you know, if I would say that would be great if whoever comes forward for the subcommittee, you know, the intention is for those two persons to present. However, you're not locked in. If something comes up along the way, we need to swap out, you know, timing doesn't work out, and another board member is willing to step in and pinch hit, I think we can do that. Our board can do that. So I don't think anyone needs to feel pressured to be locked into anything, but if you do have the time to put in to kind of, you know, create this clay that Dr. Dominguez talked about so that it can be molded a little more, like Kat said, it really was a great experience.
Madam President brings up a really good point. There is a formality here where I actually do need kind of a set in stone to establish a committee because of the APA and board members discussing business outside of normal business meetings. We have to keep it to that two-person committee. And so I do need the motion and those two people pre-selected so we know who the committee is comprised of. But past that point, whoever the presentation team is, that decision can be made later. It can be made at the November meeting or the December meeting. And actually that decision on the presentation team doesn't necessarily need to be a motion or a vote. It doesn't have to be board business. Very similar to, you know, delegates and alternates. Whoever is available, whoever is going to be able to put this or squeeze this into their schedule and provide enough time on the calendar to do the presentation. Again, I can't tell you when the presentation is going to be yet. And I won't have an estimate as to, or even an idea of when that presentation hearing will be until early 2022. I say early 2022. I want us to like keep that in mind. First quarter 2022 is going to be the earliest that I know when we're going to have the presentation team. This year, I can tell you that because of COVID and of other legislative conflicts and hearings and, you know, those kind of things, the schedule was rescheduled 2 or 3 times for other boards and bureaus. So, and some never actually got their day in hearing. They had to have some, you know, conversations between the legislature and the board and extensions and that kind of thing, but a hearing was never held. So hopefully when we get into 2022, that's not the case anymore. We're starting to normalize and everything's getting a little bit better, but just keeping that in mind, I can't commit even an estimate of time as to when this hearing is going to happen.
Thank you for that, Jason. So if there's someone, another member who's thinking, I do want to get involved and kind of learn a little more and get my hands dirty, but I don't know that right now I would want to be the one who presents, that is completely fine. And if along the way you feel like, yep, I'm getting the hang of this more, I've got a good handle on the information, I do want to present, that's fine too. So, you know, if anyone feels like they want to put their name forward and give it a shot, I'm sure the rest of the members will support you.
This is Daniel. I'm faced with some time constraints that I don't know at this point. I think that I'm probably not going to be able to attend a November 4 meeting. My mother's coming to visit, and that will unfortunately take priority over the board. And then with regard to presenting, I would feel very comfortable with presenting. My challenge with presenting to the legislature is the advance time notice. Working in the very busy hospital situation, getting today off with less than a month's notice was a difficult thing because of having to have coverage to be able to see patients in the hospital. So if we have notice of, if we had enough advance notice, I can put in my request for time away from the hospital and potentially be able to do it. But that's what I'm faced with at this point.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Jason, this is Jesus. Could I ask a question about the process? So for my dear colleagues who have been part of this committee in the past, what kind of, how would you characterize the time commitment? And I only say that because I sort of, in Daniel's footsteps here, this is a particularly busy semester for me academically. I just want to make sure if I'm going to volunteer to do something, I don't sell the process short. I want to be able to participate. So, Alicia or Kat, do you have a sense of what the time commitment was like when you were a subcommittee crafting this?
Hey, Jesus, it's Katerina. I think Jason mentioned prior that the timeline is definitely different than when we participated 5 years ago. I think you're sort of going to be on an expedited calendar. So I don't think your time commitment is going to be as intensive as what our experience was. We did meet really frequently and, over the course of several days and all that. So I think staff is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. It's more so reviewing it initially before the full board gets a chance to weigh in on it. So I wouldn't stray away from that because of necessarily time commitment. But your schedule is very busy. But that's just my understanding based on what Jason said prior.
Thanks, Katerina, for that. That kind of helps me frame a decision here.
Yeah, I'll just to add a little bit of context to it. If you recall last time around with a lot more advance notice, we were able to schedule a number of full board meetings. And then the commitment for the committee in between was, we met at least weekly. And there were a couple times where we met in person in between those meetings with the full board. And then we would also do phone conferencing, but at least once a week. But, Kat has a great point. I don't think that there's really opportunity for that in this very, abbreviated schedule and fast-moving pace. And again, we were actually identifying some pretty substantive, topics the last go around. And in my view, I think we have a lot less substance to really be asking for legislative assistance for. So I think it could be a much more streamlined process. And I think anybody serving on the committee, I'll just pitch it out there one more time. To the extent that we can, I'm going to have my staff, shoulder, as much of the workload as possible, and not make this a too burdensome, committee to commit to.
So, Jason, we have another meeting on the 4th. Would you expect that the committee would meet at least once between now and then again between then and December, or a couple times between then and December? Would that be a half a day? Would that be a full day? What would that look like?
Yeah, so I think ideally, at the conclusion of this meeting, this draft that we've kind of put together and presented to you just to kind of give you a visual representation of what we're looking at, we would be sending out to the committee tomorrow. Right. We want at least, for them to have it for a few days to be able to review it. But I would like to put something together the latter part of next week and at least have a 2 to 4 hour phone conversation where we can kind of strategize, with the committee members, schedule doodle poll, if you will, to try and figure out what availability does really look like. This is one of the difficult things is trying to do this in this electronic format. I mean, this is definitely much easier to do when we're able to fishbowl in the same room and, you know, share a screen and edit the document as we go. With this advent of technology, you think things would be a little bit easier. In this case, I think it just makes it a little bit more complicated. So again, at least a phone conversation next week, and then trying to determine what a good schedule would look like between now and then. I mean, hopefully, you know, using that annual draft report idea of plugging all the data in, taking our quarterly board meeting data and plugging it in, the November 4th meeting should have a pretty workable draft, right? And then we'll be able to kind of iron some of those concepts out with the full board anyway. And then again, after we convene that meeting, the committee can go back and fine tune things as we see fit for that final presentation in December.
Jason, this is Jesus. Thank you. And Alicia, thank you for sort of the context there. It makes things a little clearer. I was just under the assumption that we were talking about full day or multiple day, 8-hour day sessions between now and November. I just had no sense of time, but if there is some flexibility allowed in scheduling, and, I'm just going to preemptively ask for forgiveness if I become just a little deficient, but I'd be willing to participate.
Thank you, Jesus.
Sure. I feel like I have to since I put the motion forward. I'm on the button. So
I don't want you to feel obligated by anything,
no, not at all.
but if you feel like you can, given what you've heard, then of course, I believe your fellow members would fully support you being on this committee.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you again for just sort of the time frame of this. I'd be happy to participate.
Okay. So we've got 2 volunteers.
We do.
We've got a public member and we've got a licensed member.
We do.
Okay.
I'll just say one last thing. It also falls into kind of the alignment that I've always expressed. I want each board member to experience, all these different kinds of things. And Sunset is always one of those things where, whether it's board meetings and we want to come to your hometown, or we want to come to your facility or your school, or or something like that, or have you serve on a committee with FSDPT, or participate in outreach or something like that. This is a great opportunity. I'm completely happy.
Yep. Absolutely.
This is Daniel. I have a question. In my mind, thinking that it might be good to additionally have potentially a newer board member participate in the process. But I believe that would put us into, if we go to 3 board members, then we run into the problem of having to have a publicly noticed meeting, blah, blah, blah. Is that correct?
Okay. That is correct. Well, it would be limited to 2. And I believe we have Michael on the line if he wants to make any kind of clarity when it comes to the Open Meetings Act and committees consisting of more than 2 members.
That is correct, Dr. Drummer and Mr. Kaiser, that a committee of more than 2 persons would be required to follow the Open Meetings Act agendas, public meetings, public comment, but a committee of 2 does not.
Thank you, Mr. Knotes.
And so with our 2 committee members set, if a meeting is called and one is just not able to make it for some reason, can you call for an alternate board member to be a substitute just for that meeting, or does that not work?
I don't believe so, because I think that runs the risk of creating a serial meeting.
Yeah.
And again, I'll have Mr. Knotes. Michael.
That is correct. Yeah, the discussion would need to be conducted just between those 2 board members and staff, unless we're at a public meeting and it's noticed.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Jesus, for your service on this committee. We look forward to what you bring forward to the full committee or the full board on November 4th. And today, Jason, what are some of the other issues that we might be able to, as a full board, move forward on and discuss and kick around?
If I can interrupt really quickly, just a quick question. Dr. Drummer had brought up November 4th. Is November, because I have it as TBD on my calendar. Did we decide if is that going to be a virtual meeting or is that going to be an in-person meeting?
The way things are going right now, it would still be a virtual meeting.
Okay.
There is still a good possibility that even the December meeting is up in the air as to whether or not it is virtual or in person. You know.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That actually works better for me, so thank you.
Okay. A question for council one more time though, Michael. Do I need a motion and a vote for the formation of the committee members themselves, or is it perfectly acceptable to state who the committee members are and move forward?
It's within the chair's discretion to appoint a committee, so I don't think we need a motion now.
Okay, thank you. So the question that you just asked about, what are the other discussion points? So some of the leftover items from the last report are things that we asked or potentially identified needing possible legislative assistance. Staff has come up with a couple recommendations for these things. The board should actually have this discussion amongst themselves too, though, right? So these are, there's kind of a fine line where we want to make sure that staff's not driving it completely and the board is actually having their input and say. A couple things that we would ask you to consider was, when we identified it in the last sunset, is that we were at our statutory caps. We're also fiscally healthy, right? We're not asking for a fee increase of any kind, but should something happen, some unforeseen expenses, a lawsuit, or another global pandemic, or if you will, that really bit into the board's revenues or something like that. We right now are totally capped out with what we could collect in revenues, and we can't increase fees in any way, shape, or form without emergency legislation. And so while we identified it in the last sunset, it was the BMP committee's decision to not extend them at that time and that maybe address this issue at the subsequent sunset. With this kind of solace explanation that, okay, if something bad has happened in between, you could always seek emergency legislation. So here we are 5 years, 6 years down the road now. We still are faced with this issue of statutory caps. Again, by no means am I making any kind of recommendation that we have to do a fee increase, but it's just this kind of level of uncomfortability of not being able to do anything should anything bad happen. So it would be one of the recommendations that staff would make, is to address that issue a second time and see how the committee feels about extending the board's caps. Any kind of latitude would probably make me feel a little bit more, lower my anxiety level a little bit. One of the other issues that we've identified that you might be familiar with direct access is we had a waiver exemption that was provided by the director of the Department of Consumer Affairs for the in-person evaluation for direct access PT, that it didn't necessarily need to be in person. It could be through telemedicine or a video conferencing platform. And while that's provided an exemption, that exemption expires in October. We haven't had any issues with that exemption, bubble up or come up through our enforcement processes. And if you think about just the delivery of healthcare and the use of telemedicine at this point, I think it's completely and perfectly appropriate for that continuation of the plan of care to be done by a physician via a telemedicine means. Of course, that physician would have to do that within their own discretion too. If there's something that happens within that initial video call that the physician thinks that they should have an in-person meeting, we would expect them to do so. But right now they're obligated to do so. They have no choice. And so that may be something that you could ask for as a statutory change, is to make that exemption that was, we've been provided for over the last year, a permanent feature of the Practice Act.
This is Daniel.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
On the topic, actually, I would suggest that we consider removing it altogether, because there haven't been any complaints. There haven't been any issues with this. The telehealth actually provided a good option to test, to further test, because even before the telehealth piece was there, we've had no issues. We've had no complaints. We've had no concerns raised. With telehealth, or with COVID and then implementing telehealth, it pushed that boundary even further. And we've continued to have no complaints. We've had no issues with any of this. And so it was, in my mind, it was put in as a cushion to help make the physicians who were opposed to direct access, to help give them a bone and let them be comfortable, a little bit more comfortable with the concept. They're still going to be opposed just because they're going to be opposed to it on their principles. But in my mind, this is clearly demonstrated that this is not an issue, that we could potentially even see to get it removed, so that the members of the public truly have free direct access to physical therapy care without having to be burdened with having to see their physician, taking time for that, taking more expense away from the patient, having to pay a copay, having to delay further physical therapy care by having to go see the physician, or interact with the physician even as a telehealth piece. In my mind, this is potentially an opportunity for us to remove that burden from the patient.
Any other board comment on that particular topic? Armstrong?
Sorry, Madam President, this is Jesus. If I may, just so I understand, Daniel, what you're suggesting is legislatively we remove the requirement, not just telemedicine versus in person. Is that correct?
So right now it's a component of our Practice Act. And so with the sunset process, we have the opportunity to change components of our Practice Act, because it's open for change at this point. I think it's a reasonable discussion point to have, because we've gone through this testing period of direct access with this requirement that the patient has to go see their physician within time frame
45 days.
45 days or 12 visits. And if therapy services, if the therapist determines that therapy services need to continue. And so that was written in. We've tested this. There have been no issues. There have been no complaints. And then telehealth just extended that. It reduced the need, or reduced the immediate demand for the patient to have to see the physician in person, and allowed for telehealth visit to be able to happen. In my mind, it's further demonstrated that because we've had no complaints, we've had no issues, that this is something that the patients should be able to continue to see the therapist without having to have this piece of of the puzzle as the burden to the patient.
So you'd be proposing removing the 12 times or 45-day requirement altogether with having a physician sign off on the plan of care?
It's something that I think that we should consider because it's about we're about protecting the consumer and allowing the consumer to have access to physical therapist services. And it's, in my mind, it's been clearly demonstrated that this is not a need. It's been tested and we're moving past it. So I think that it's something that we should consider bringing forward.
It could certainly be identified as an access to care combination, right? You're increasing access to care and removing that barrier.
Absolutely.
But is there any evidence that it's necessary for public protection? Is our way of looking at it?
I would be remiss if I didn't kind of, chime in on this particular topic, but there's nothing, Daniel's correct, there's nothing in our data set that shows that it's created an issue of any kind. The absence of data doesn't always affirm an argument, though, and
right.
So just for that as a caveat. The only other caution that I would give you guys from the administrator's perspective is the things that you ask for in sunset, to the extent that you can not have them be controversial, you should, right? Because this is your extension, this is your sunrise bill, this is your existence into the future. If the committee were to allow something like this to be included into our sunrise bill at the request of the board, you could run the risk of, a governor veto or something like that based on stakeholder feedback and other special interest groups pushing back against this concept or idea. So, like I said, it could definitely be identified as an access to care issue and increasing access to care, especially considering the global pandemic and all the technological advances that we've made. But I think Daniel kind of touched on, there's definitely going to be an audience out there that is going to oppose this just from a principle's sake. And if they happen to have a large enough voice, that could create an issue for the board.
The nation's largest insurer, Medicare, allows direct access in states where true direct access happens. So the nation's largest insurer of probably some of our most frail and susceptible patients it's allowed. And the states that surround us all allow it. This ends up being a very charged issue with some individuals, and that's why it was written in to give them a reason to say, okay, we'll let it go. But it's been shown, it's shown so far that with an absence of data that there aren't issues. So it's something for us that I think that we need to consider. I'm not necessarily saying right now that, yes, we have to push it, but it's something that is a potential. Jason asked for potentials to consider, and I think that that's a very reasonable one that we could look at.
For conversation's sake, would you like us to collect some data to present to the committee first and have that prepared for the November 4th meeting in this particular topic?
To the degree possible, yeah. I don't know that there is. So, but yeah.
I'm wondering if it's prudent or even allowed for staff to reach out to external stakeholders. I'm thinking of the CMA and ask them. Because physicians may also agree with the physical therapist.
Sure.
Like it's another hoop to jump through.
Sure.
So it'd be interesting to see what their take is on this. because maybe they wouldn't be as opposed as we think they might be.
This is Jesus. Just a quick comment. Daniel, thank you for the context, because when you said we haven't had, I'm just terribly paraphrasing here, but we haven't had any problems. But just so I'm clear, the requirement never was omitted. It was just modified to allow for telemedicine. So in this state, unless I'm mistaken, direct access still held to that 12 visit, 45-day limit. What was allowed now was for that visit to be through telehealth. Is that correct? So the real test of we haven't had any problems would have been not having the requirement in this state. That's what I was wrestling with. But as you pointed out, there are other states that truly have direct access, and there doesn't seem, at least across states, there doesn't seem to be, I don't know, I'm making that statement under assumption. There doesn't seem to be any issues, any reports of, patient harm because of true direct access.
So after the implementation of AB 1000, where we received temporary direct access, we know for maybe a short duration of time, it might have taken a while to get that kind of ramped up and people actually started utilizing it. But once that starts happening, a patient could come to a PT directly for those 12 visits or those 45 days, whichever comes first. And then if it's established that patient would continue with that PT, the PT thinks that they still need to continue along that path, that patient under AB 1000 would have to go and have an in-person appointment with their physician, so the physician could sign off on the PT's plan of care and then continue past that point. And we've looked at it and it's been interpreted that then it would just start the 12 visits of 45 days over again, right? And then so there's that kind of continually checking back in for somebody who needs that reoccurring treatment. During the global pandemic, this board identified that it may be very difficult for a patient to get that in-person appointment to extend their physical therapy services, just because of the workload and the burden that was happening in healthcare at the time, hospitals, clinics not being open, those kind of things, and PT, being on the lower priority list for knee injuries and those kind of things. So in cooperation with the Department of Consumer Affairs and the director of the Department of Consumer Affairs, based on the governor's executive order, we asked for that waiver, that instead of having that in-person meeting, could that now be done through a telemedicine means, through a teleconferencing software or what have you. And you're both correct. I don't have a recollection of AB 1000 causing us any issues, let alone the exemption that was provided during COVID. Right? So, but just for context's sake, that's something that we can probably pull a little bit more accurate data for. And if there's anything there that, I think might be relevant to the conversation, we can bring it back through the committee into the November meeting.
Thanks for that, Jason. You just jogged my memory for some reason. So under current guidelines, the 12 visit, 45 day, the process is served and the patient is seen by the physician, it sort of resets the timeline, right? But it's a continuous 12 visit. That's what was escaping my memory. Thanks for that clarification.
And currently, as long as that governor's exemption is in there and the director's exemption is there, they can still do that sign off on the plan of care with their physician through a telemedicine means. Once that expires, we'd go back to the original authority and it would have to be an in-person meeting.
I just have a sort of a procedural question. Is sunset our only opportunity to change this in the near future, or is there an opportunity to change Practice Act outside of sunset?
There's always an opportunity outside of sunset, right? So if there's something that there's a recent effect or change in culture or society that the board thinks is a threat to consumer protection, I and the president can go to the Capitol and try to find a legislator, a senator, or assemblyman to help us author a bill to make whatever change it is that we're looking to make. So it doesn't necessarily have to happen in sunset. We have as much opportunity to lobby at the Capitol as any other association or special interest group has.
Thank you. I do agree that after we collect data, that it would be good to make that change, however, in the spring during sunset.
This is Daniel. I have to ask for clarification because in the conversation that Jason and Jesus were just having, I believe my understanding is that a patient can see a physical therapist with using direct access when they don't have a diagnosis, when they don't have a medical diagnosis. The physical therapist is allowed to initiate care and can provide care for 12 visits or 45 days. And that's because there's not a medical diagnosis that's been provided to the patient that's associated with what the physical therapist is treating. But the reason for the going to see the physician is really about getting a diagnosis, getting a medical diagnosis that's associated with a condition, so that then once the diagnosis is provided, the physical therapist can continue to see the patient without having to go back to see the physician again. That there is not a continuation or a repeat, a reset of 45 days or 12 visits. That it actually, once the diagnosis is provided, then the patient can see the physical therapist for what they need. I mean, it's good practice that if things are not progressing as expected, that the physical therapist refers back to the physician to say, hey, you know what I thought was going on is something different, or things are a little bit funkier than what I thought. Something we need to dive in deeper for different diagnostics. But once a diagnosis is established, a patient can go see a physical therapist without having to have a new referral or prescription, throwing that evil word out, because that doesn't apply to physical therapist care. Am I correct?
No, you're correct. There is a kind of a point of confusion that, just so there's some clarity's sake, there's the practical application that we know in the real world, and also the technical nature in which the language is written, right? And so the actual technical nature of the language of AB 1000 is that after 12 visits or 45 days, whichever comes first, the patient shall go before their physician and surgeon and have the physician or surgeon sign off on the plan of care. And the practicality of that is, at the same time, coincidentally, they're probably going to get their diagnosis, which now essentially turns the AB 1000 authority off, and it's no longer necessary. So you're right. You don't need it. You don't need direct access when you actually have a diagnosis to work off of. Without it, if for some reason that actually doesn't happen, that's when you would really be bound and tied back to that 12 visits or 45 days. Or if you have a new incidence of care, right? It's a different type of injury, non-related to the original or anything like that, then the AB 1000 would be binding again. So there is this kind of practical applied, but it doesn't really translate to the technical nature in which the language is written.
It would, in my mind, it would be really unexpected that a physician wouldn't provide a diagnosis if a patient had been under care by somebody. Right. So that, because the physician's going to need to justify for their further care, their further treatment with a diagnosis. And then, yeah, if there's something new that happens, I was treated for my sprained ankle, but now I have back pain, probably related to my sprained ankle, but and having to
Right.
use crutches or whatever. And then, yeah, now I have back pain from that. But it's a different issue. It's a different diagnosis. But actually, what did I hear? That back pain is no longer going to be a diagnosis and a realistic diagnosis anymore.
I would
that recently.
appreciate that.
That it's being removed from the list.
Yeah.
It needs to be more specific.
I would like a little bit more specificity. It would make my job easier.
Yeah, that just the diagnosis of back pain is no longer going to be accepted. That has to be a much more specific diagnosis.
Yeah, I get it all the time. So can I ask about, the spirit of the 12 visits in 45 days? So in the perspective of public protection, most of the time, physical therapists treat and people get better, right? And there's those cases where they don't. But there's usually a set amount of time that we'll see patients for. And so from a protection perspective, if the patient was not needing therapy anymore, we would send them to the physician for a check-in to see if there's something else going on, right? And as a therapist, we're doing that all along anyway, whether it's the first visit or the 12th visit. If we need to refer back, we're doing that anyway. But by the 12th visit, if we're not ready to discharge, if we feel there's still room for improvement, they've got to go see their doctor first.
Correct.
And is that why that was included in?
So just kind of keep in mind the negotiations that occurred over AB 1000 were also tied with a number of other different kind of conversations. And as a regulatory board, we weren't really involved in these conversations. So I'm only speculating when I say I assume so. I think the parties that were involved in those conversations came up with a happy compromise between the two issues. And so 12 visits in 45 days, I believe, was probably crafted after what would be the ideal in and out, where we could avoid having to have a physician involved and make this easier for the PT consumer. At the same time, and conversely, there was probably another represented party there that was saying we also don't want to just give them free rein so that they could overutilization and do whatever they want. We still want that kind of crafted public protection that involves the physician or surgeon included. And there's the number, right? The 12 visits, the 45 days. Just for argument's sake, there are going to be perspectives that are going to point out that this is a lessening in consumer protection to some degree. And should that be done from a regulator's perspective? I think that, like I said, there is a very strong argument to be made here that this is an access to care issue, like an unnecessary barrier, if you will. And we're just looking at and having the discussion of removing that. For appropriateness, it's appropriate for this board to have this conversation. It's even more appropriate for this conversation to occur at the association level, right? And the association could opine on sunset, right? So they could also provide, input into sunset of things that they think are necessary to change. I also think, the California Physical Therapy Association is very savvy and sensitive to the idea of the board sunset also, right? So if they did have something that they thought was very, highly contested and, controversial, they wouldn't ask us to include it. They wouldn't present it to the legislature to have it included into our sunset because they want to make sure that we continue to exist, for the next 5 or 6 years, which is why they also have the vehicle to go to the Capitol and lobby a senator or assemblyman to champion a bill and present whatever cause they might want, to run through the legislature. So the 12 visits in the 45 days, I wish we were more involved at the time, but that was a very, very much a special interest, CMA, CPTA conversation that was occurring. And at the same time as the corporation's issue was occurring. And so I think there was a little bit of a negotiation, help us here and we'll help you there. Okay, that's fine, but help us here and we'll help you there, kind of thing.
Jason, do you remember what year AB 1000 happened?
I can get that for you in just a second. It was, I want to say 2012, but I have a fact checker in the background who's getting it for me, right?
Okay. And it was very much discussions, CPTA, the California Medical Association. I believe the Chiropractor Association was also involved in those discussions at that time. And then it was deliberation with the legislators who were on both sides, who were heavily involved. And it went back and forth through several different iterations to get to the final language. And it was done as an acceptable bargain between all the parties at that time. But there was no true justification as to why it needed to be. There was no data that showed that this is what it needed to be. So
very, very similar to most legislation. You know, you don't always get to see the reasoning behind the changes that are made.
2013.
Yeah, so AB 1000 went into effect in 2013.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Jesus. Both Jason, Daniel, thank you for very informative conversation here. Yeah, and Daniel, I think that you and I were kind of coming on the board right around that time. And this is just a comment with respect to the language. When I talk to practicing clinicians, half of them think that this requirement is because they need a medical diagnosis. The other half say, well, I need a physician sign off on the plan of care. So even in the practicing community, there's still a little, misinterpretation or various interpretations.
And that's what I was kind of alluding to earlier is the technical nature of the language very much is sign off on the plan of care. And that's credited to the authors who crafted the language, whatever that agreement was between the two parties and the author. But as Daniel kind of pointed out, that's an opportunity, we know, mechanically speaking, where the physician is probably going to reveal what the diagnosis is. And so essentially it's a shift from now, it's not really direct access anymore. Now you are back to a normal access model because the diagnosis is prevalent and available. Unless there's any more conversation about that particular topic, obviously we'll bring back some data for the committee, but I just want to address or go back and talk about expanding the caps for our fees and kind of find out what the board thinks about that.
We can move on to that. Before so, though, if we're going to identify outside stakeholders that we might reach out to regarding the previous topic, since CPTA was brought up and the Chiropractic Association was brought up, that might be two others that we check in with.
And we'll try to make that happen between now and the 4th also.
And the CMA, if possible.
They're on the list.
Okay. And I don't know if the medical board would potentially have, if they've collected any data.
I will add them to the list and see.
Thanks.
I do realize that our job is to look at this from a public protection perspective, and ultimately that's what I'll do. As a practicing clinician, whenever I do come across a situation where my client needs the face-to-face, I can think of many instances where we had to hold therapy for someone who could really use the services. And my particular setting is home health. And so this person has a very taxing and difficult time getting out of the home and going. I realized that, you know, we could also ask for a teleconference, but in my neck of the woods, coming across available physicians is difficult as well. And having, you know, availability for appointments is difficult for many patients of certain socioeconomic status. So I think that's just my professional and personal frustration with having to deal with face-to-face sign-offs with physicians and delaying care for clients. I think we heard a little bit about that last sunset toward the end when CPTA had some pediatric issues, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Any further
Jason?
comment on this? Yes, go right ahead.
I do have a question. Jason, are you aware of any other jurisdictions with populations that are, you know, larger, how they handle this issue, or, you know, what their laws are regarding access to care and doctors?
And you're thinking of physical therapy specifically?
Yes.
Yeah, there are a number of states in the United States that have complete direct access, meaning, you know, the consumer can approach a physical therapist and the physical therapist can provide a physical therapy-based evaluation / diagnosis, even though we know that that's the kind of tiebreaker word that people don't want to have applied, and can continue to see that physical therapist for physical therapy services as appropriate without the involvement of a physician or surgeon. And as Daniel kind of mentioned, that model exists in a number of different states throughout the union and is provided, you know, and is paid for by some of the largest insurance providers in the nation. Some of them have had that authority for a very long time. Some are a little bit newer, but it seems like as years go by, it's a more and more accepted model, and it's just kind of coming our way.
I see. Thank you. There might be some good case studies too of, you know, folks who rolled this out a few years ago and where they are.
This is Daniel. When AB 1000 was being rolled out, I remember at that time seeing information and presenting information to legislators that the surrounding states, all of the states that California touches, and then doesn't touch but is closest to California, to Hawaii, all of those states have direct access and had direct access at that time. In 2011 and 12, I believe, was when the process was happening of having those discussions. So all of those states have had direct access since that time. They had it before then and since that time. And there are patients, consumers in California who live in border towns who can go across the state line and go get direct access to physical therapist services because they can't do that here because of what the law says. At that point, they were able to do that. Now they can in California with some constraint.
So it sounds like, based on Kat and Daniel's comments, that we might consider adding to the list, Jason, to maybe reaching out to one or more of our border states if there's any information to be collected there and brought back.
Sure. That information's fairly readily easy to obtain, so that's not a problem.
Great. Sounds good. Any other board discussion?
On the topic or the new topic?
This past topic, the prior topic.
Madam President, this is Michael. I know we're discussing items for sunset, but I do think that based on this discussion on the issue, that we should probably open for, perhaps you were about to do that, but we should perhaps open for public comment on the direct access issue.
Thank you, Council. I was thinking of it and wasn't sure, so I appreciate the nudge. So before I open it to public comment, any further board comment or discussion? Okay, and moderator, can you please facilitate public comment?
Sure, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access that Q&A panel and submit their requests. This is the moderator. Seeing no requests for public comment, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. I do want to move on to the next topic regarding fee cap. We are at about 10:45 almost. And if I may suggest that we take just a very short recess until 10 till, so maybe about a 7-minute recess until, gosh, I can't even read the clock. How about 10:55? It's 10:45 right now, right? 10:55, we'll take that subject and then go into closed session at 11:30, and then break for our lunch break and come back at 1:30. So I'll see you all in about 10 minutes. Okay. You let me know we're ready. Hello, everyone.
This is the moderator. Let me go ahead and hit unpause on that recording. All right.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. If we could, have everyone turn on your video when you're ready, and then we'll be able to see that we've got all of our members back. Look, if you can help me visualize everyone. I'm not sure that I can see everyone on my screen.
If you go to top right layout.
Mm-hmm.
Madam President, it probably is best practice after breaks to go ahead and take roll to make sure we have quorum.
Thank you. Okay, we'll do that.
Alicia Benaimez.
Here.
Katarina Ellaby.
Present.
Dale Armstrong.
Present.
Jesus Dominguez. Daniel Drummer.
Here.
Jonathan Urban. Jonathan Urban is absent. Tanya McMillian. All members are present with the exception of Jonathan Urban, and the board has a quorum.
Thank you. Okay, Jason.
So I'd just like to kind of revisit that first issue that we identified, essentially updating the fee statute. Again, it is something we identified in the previous sunset. We are at our statutory caps. The legislature within the Practice Act gives the board its authority in a range of fees that it should have the authority to adjust in between. And so we are at the ceiling at this point. And again, just as and I'll express very strenuously, we're also in a healthy fund condition situation. But as you've seen projections over the last couple of years, we can project a deficit going into like 23, 24, 24, 25 fiscal years. So just in preparation for that, and for my own kind of level of comfort as the administrator, preparing for a rainy day, any unforeseen expenses, any unforeseen costs when it comes to things like lawsuits or major changes in the way physical therapy is regulated, the examination services, anything like that, where we don't have any room in the budget for it, and it could have a significant impact on the board's fund condition. That's where we would propose to the board through regulation an increase in fees if we had the authority, and currently we don't. And so it's not just an automatic overnight kind of thing anyway. Even with an increase in the statute, to actually increase the fees would require a regulatory package, and so we're going to ask for stakeholder feedback, and we're going to have to provide a fee study to justify why we want to raise the fees. And we addressed all of those kinds of things in the last legislative report, or the last sunset report, as an issue, with a lot of these same kind of concerns. Last time around, they just said we had just received a very recent fee increase, and our fund was starting to build up, so they didn't find it necessary to increase the statutory caps at that time. Essentially, we're just taking a second stab at it. 5 years has gone by. We're in a very similar situation. I don't necessarily need a fee increase, but to the extent that I might need one in the future, I would like to have a statutory authority to at least try to promulgate through regulation a fee increase.
To your knowledge, has this ever been done before?
I don't know that I know of any situation like in similar circumstances, right? So very often the model that I see sometimes in sunset is that the fee increase is actually done through the sunset process in legislation, which avoids that particular board having to do its fee increases through the regulatory process. And that's usually in a kind of an emergent situation where, for whatever reason, they weren't prepared for an impending insolvency or something like that. We've always been very prudent and frugal with the money that we have, and have kept track of it very well. And any time that we've ever thought that there were any kind of issues, we rang the bells, right? We sounded the alarms. This time around, the last time around in sunset, we also had a general fund loan issue that really kind of took our fund condition down to a 2-week fund condition at one point. But as soon as we got that threat of insolvency, we received our general fund loan money back, which did, help make the fund healthier, but that only lasted for a certain amount of time before it was necessary to increase the fees. The fee increase was successful enough and significant enough that, we were able to advance, get the proper, staffing levels that we need, although we're still short in some areas because of licensee population growth. We've talked about that in the past about PTA programs coming online, and we're going to see a significant increase in applications there. So is there a potential that we would need a fee increase in the next 5 years? Absolutely, I think there is. There's all kinds of different things that I could imagine would cause or generate that need for a fee increase. But without that statutory authority, that's not an option. When that's not an option and you are at your statutory caps outside of the sunset process, and Dr. Armstrong kind of asked that question, are there other opportunities to make legislative change? There certainly are. But in the sunset process, we're here, we're now, we have the hood up on the car. So if we're going to make repairs, let's, fix some of everything. Or if not, if the legislature through this recommendation and the board sees or agrees with staff's recommendation and we make the argument and they still say no, such time as we start to become a threat of insolvency, we'll have to pound the pavement at the Capitol and find a legislator who's willing to, craft a bill of emergency legislation to fix our fees for us. The other alternatives are seeking, financial assistance from other boards and bureaus. So you have had situations where certain boards have loaned money from other boards who can't afford it. And I would like to avoid that.
Mm-hmm. So this route has not, to your knowledge, been, thought out from the legislature before?
I've seen boards lobby for an increase in their statutory caps through the sunset process.
Yeah.
But they were also in financial dire straits.
Okay.
Right. So that's the slight difference between us, is that we are almost in a similar situation that we were last time, where we don't need the money today.
Yeah.
I don't need to do a fee increase today. We are just kind of planning for the future. But I have seen the legislature increase fees through a sunset process for a board who was having financial problems to begin with.
So I'm wondering if there would be any, like, devil's advocate pushback from legislature, the joint committee, saying, you know, let's look 20 years, 30 years into the future, and you expect your licensing population to continue to grow. Will you always expect your fees to have to increase because of that? Will you be seeking this out, you know, regularly?
Yeah.
Is that the usual?
That's kind of an ongoing conversation that we will have going forward, and we have had in the past, right? So the existing statutory authority that we have now caps out at that $300. Well, we were at 100 before, and if the legislature had given us the authority to increase our fees commensurate with the services we provide up to $300, essentially before we have to go back and check in with the legislature to get more authority. So it's almost a level of trust issue. The legislature is saying, okay, if you can establish a fee and provide a rationale for it and do it through the regulatory process, you guys can go up to 300. Well, we're there.
Yeah.
And so we don't have any room from this point forward unless they extend that again. How they go about determining what the next increase is kind of somewhat arbitrary. Part of it is based on projections, and part of it is just based on whatever, you know, trend data that you might be able to provide, which I think we can provide quite a bit. And then also just the trust level of the legislature at that point. How often does the legislature feel like they need to check in on a board's fiscal condition? I'm hoping that that's not an issue with us in the legislature, that they look at our fund condition and the way we've spent our money over the last 10 years, and it doesn't raise any eyebrows.
Okay, I'm going to pause now for some board comment or questions.
This is Daniel. Jason, can you remind us when the last fee increase was implemented?
Yeah, it'll take me a second to get it for you, but I'll get it for you.
I believe it was right before or not long before our last sunset. And
Yeah.
that part of the reason that the legislators denied, because we had just gone to the
Correct.
to the max. We had just increased our fees. And so we had no track record of how we were going to be performing with the new fees, the new increased fees that we had just established. Is that kind of right?
Yeah. We started the process in 2014, but the fees went into effect in 2015. And so you're right. We had just recently started collecting those additional revenues while we were going through sunset. And it was hard to determine, you know, what that impact might have. I think there's actually an argument there that while we increased fees, we increased them to the caps. And by my math and by staff's math, we thought that it would be sufficient. But sometimes you never know. I mean, yes, we've just increased the fee, but is it going to be enough, right? And so in 2016, I thought we had a very compelling and convincing argument that we needed an additional kind of threshold to kind of meet. And it didn't go well. So, but it was almost simultaneous with the sunset process.
Jesus, real quick, could you remind me what the previous cap was before it was increased to 300? So what kind of
So the cap has been 300 for a very long time.
Okay.
Right. But we increased the fees in 2016 from $200 to $300.
That I remember.
We increased fees across the board. Like we also increased application fees and those kind of things. But the fee authority had been $300 for a very long time.
So yeah, the only reason I ask is, so what kind of parameters potentially are we supposed to be working within if we, you know, propose a cap increase? $100? $200. I'm just curious.
Yeah, and if you think about when we did it through regulation last time around, there's a couple of different methodologies you can use. It depends on essentially kind of how difficult your math is. If it's very easy, and I think for us it was very easy to demonstrate kind of our fiscal dire straits. Here are the revenue models with the current fees. This is the type of monies that we can be, reasonably expecting to pull in through revenues over the next couple of years, and they just don't sustain the size of the board. And whether or not the size of the board is, commensurate with the services based on your licensing population. And that was kind of one of the other issues, is we were still kind of going through growing pains. We were getting the job done, but we were doing it through creative means. But we did definitely need more staff. It was very easy for us to put together a package that even the Department of Finance, through the regulatory process, signed off on because the math was very compelling. When the math gets a little bit, more clouded, or there's more detail than necessarily could be digested by just staff, and more of a kind of a forensic accounting needs to happen, you can hire an outside firm to come out and do a fee audit, and they'll take your business processes apart and try to figure out, are you charging too little? Are you charging too much? And they'll make a recommendation. And you can use that data to, essentially present to the legislature, this is the kind of cap extension that we would like. In the last sunset review, we didn't even make that recommendation. We just wanted something, right? Because we were at the cap, it wouldn't have mattered if it was $50 or $100, until such time as we needed a fee increase, we were okay. But in case it was just kind of a rainy day situation or an emergent situation, we wanted a little bit of a cushion.
Thank you for that. So it's not necessarily a parameter set in stone. It's more of a justification.
Definitely not.
Okay. And this is kind of an interesting point to make when it comes to the difference between fees being increased through legislation and fees being increased through regulation. When we establish a proposal of a fee change in regulation, we have to be very specific in why we're asking for the amount of monies that we're asking for, right? So let's just, hypothetically, if we were going to go from 300 to 350, we would have to be able to explain why. The legislature does not have to be able to explain how much it's going to give you as a ceiling, right? But for you to change within that ceiling, we have to be very specific through that promulgation of regulation.
But it's through regulation that that the board has control over the numbers, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and essentially, we would do a fiscal analysis and bring a recommendation to the board like, hey, our fund condition is dwindling away, and we anticipate the need of a fee increase in the, sub-dollar amount, and present it to the board. The board would then, have to look at that language and concur with staff or not, provide an alternative recommendation, what have you. But through regulation, it is really the onus is on my staff and you as members to determine what that number is.
And then we come up with a number and it goes through the regulation process.
It goes through the regulation process. And then stakeholders and feedback and all of that kind of thing can affect whether that fee remains as, through the duration of the package or not.
Okay.
The last time we did it through regulation, the math was just that compelling. And we did not have any adverse comments. I think our whole licensing population understood that in a number of different ways compared to other professions within California, we had fairly low fees. And compared to other states for physical therapy service renewal fees, we had very low fees for the state of California. So there wasn't any negative feedback of any kind during that process, and the association did not provide any kind of negative feedback to that fee increase either. And I'm also a firm believer that if I increase the fees, at the very least, I have to maintain the level of service I'm providing today and then some. So I think we've demonstrated that as well.
I think my comment is if we present it within the sunset report as a request, it seems to me that it would seem that that the PT board is being proactive in planning rather than us waiting for an emergency situation.
Dr. Armstrong, I certainly appreciate your perspective because that's our intent, right? I'm looking at I'd like to avoid emergent circumstances where we would have to seek any kind of emergency legislation. I would like to be fiscally responsible and plan ahead. And that is somewhat, maybe contrary to the typical governmental model. We tend to be very reactionary. And I think because of our function, there might be a little onus or responsibility on us as the administrators to, just change our shift in perspective to something that is a little bit more proactive. But that's what I think we're trying to do here. And we were trying to do it in the last sunset too. We're good. We got a fee increase, but you never know sometimes. I mean, this board has had legal issues in the past with some very contentious topics that involved our board versus another board or our board versus the association or something like that. And those can be unforeseen expenses and they can be very costly. As we've grown, those costs don't have as big of an impact as they did early on, but they still have quite an impact. So if anything more like that to happen, I'd like to think that we have enough saved in our fund condition that it wouldn't disrupt any kind of operations.
Ms. Ellaby, Ms. McMillian, any comments or questions?
This is Katerina. I definitely remember this as a major sticking point at the last sunset. And I believe you're right, Dr. Drummer, that the timing just wasn't right for us at that sunset review. But the analogy that Jason uses, comparing it to a maxed out credit card and just not having that ability to be nimble should something arise, I think is a major problem. And we're one of those boards that are proactive and not reactive. And sometimes I guess that's not what they're used to receiving or used to hearing from the various boards and bureaus. So I definitely think we should include it in this sunset presentation because it's us doing our due diligence as a board to make sure that we are always keeping in mind that there are unforeseen circumstances or events that we want to prepare ourselves for.
Thank you, Ms. Ellaby. Any other board comment or question? Staff comment?
Is there anything that the board would like to see maybe in further presentation through the committee and then on to the November 4th meeting data-wise? I mean, you have the fund condition, you have the quarterly data that we always provide, but is there a value in trying to come up with a request? While the statutory cap is 300 right now, and we're just asking for an increase in the cap, or are we asking for a specific dollar amount in the increase in the cap? If I reverted back to my old argument from the previous sunset, I didn't present a dollar amount that I was interested in. I just wanted something, and I based that decision and the recommendation on what I had seen just through legislative history. A lot of it had to do with what the legislature or how the legislature felt about a board and the way it spent its money. And so I didn't want to be so presumptuous as to say, and we think the statutory cap should be. But maybe that's the reason, one of the reasons why they didn't address the request is because they didn't have the time or wherewithal to determine what that dollar amount fee increase might be. And I've struggled with that for about 5 years, because it's, should we have or should we not have? I think we did the right thing. So I think just for conversation's sake, I'd like to hear the members' input on that as to whether or not we think we should move forward with a specific amount request or we should still leave it open-ended.
Hey, Jason, it's Kat. I would definitely like to see sort of a timeline of how much the fees have increased since the board's creation and when. And then also an analysis of boards with our similar population size, where their fees are currently, because I think that'll help inform if we choose to put a dollar amount, what dollar amount that might be.
And would you like to see those numbers California specific or also PT specific statewide or United States wide?
I guess perhaps both.
Okay.
This is Daniel. Along that, I think it may be valuable to try to determine like percentages of average salaries compared to what the fee is in the other states or across the other professions. That may be helpful information as well. You talked about how our fees are lower, basically, in comparison to other professions, what other boards have. And so what's the relationship between what their average salaries are and then what the fee is, or something to address with the cost of business, essentially, and then what the percentage, what the relative fee is. I think that may be helpful to give us a little bit a better stake in the request.
This is Tanya. So what, I think those are fair requests, Dr. Drummer and Kat, but I want to know what role would the cost of living play, because we know they're different per state. So maybe showing those comparisons based on the cost of living for each state. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in fact, when I was writing down what Dr. Drummer was recommending, that I actually have salary / cost of living written down, because and the reason I wrote it down for my own selfish argument is this is California. There's not a lot of places in the United States that have a higher cost of living, or even a higher salary for that matter. So if we have one of the highest salaries and the highest cost of living, but one of the, not the lowest fees, because there are definitely lower fees throughout the union, but comparing it to some of the larger jurisdictions that we often compare to, like Florida or Texas or New York, I could certainly, provide us with something that kind of maps that out.
This is Jesus. That's a great point. It's very valuable to sort of get a landscape, but sort of have to be strategic about it. We are California. We're pretty darn expensive out here, and to be compared to another state where the cost of living is less, the salaries likely are less, the fees are less. May not be telling the whole story. Sure. So yeah, we're pretty unique out here. And while I have just the floor quickly here, getting back to your question about would it be appropriate to just ask for an increase or put some sort of percentage or or actual number on it, I'd probably recommend the latter, especially in your opinion, if last time it came down to, well, we don't have, the legislation may not have had any reference. Like, well, how much would they be thinking about if we do a little bit of the legwork and make the case, or whatever that, I don't know what that number would be, but whatever it is, maybe that would give us a better opportunity for success.
I think it was, as we've discussed, it was a number of factors of why I think our request wasn't addressed. And I think while that might have been part of it, we talked about just the timing of it. The fee increase had just gone into effect and those kind of things. But that's the internal struggle that I've had is what we would have, could have, should have done, would we be in a different place? So I appreciate the feedback.
Okay. Before we open it up to public comment, any further board comment, questions, discussion, or staff comment?
No, I think we have a little homework, some data to collect, and we can get for you. Again, I appreciate it.
Board members? Okay, and moderator, can you please facilitate public comment?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. This is the moderator. At this time, it appears there are no requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. And so we are going to step away from that agenda item for the moment until after lunch and move on to agenda item number 9 for now, which is closed session. So I am wondering if we should give our council, I don't even know what you call it, control for the meeting for closed session?
This is the moderator. Let me go ahead and hit pause on the recording, and I will get the closed session room set up.
Thank you. Back from lunch recess, it is 1:31. Can we have roll call, please?
Alicia Benayamin.
Here.
Katerina Ellaby. Katerina Ellaby. I'll come back. Dale Armstrong. Jesus Dominguez.
Present.
Daniel Drummer.
Present.
Jonathan Irvin. Jonathan Irvin is absent. Tanya McMillian.
Here.
Katerina Ellaby. Katerina Ellaby.
We can move forward, and then just once she comes online, we'll put in the record when she returns.
Okay.
Okay. All members are present with the exception of Jonathan Irvin and possibly Katerina Ellaby, and the board has a quorum.
Thank you very much. And I will hand it back over to Jason Kaiser, and he'll give us a little idea of what the afternoon will look like.
So we are still addressing agenda items 5 and 6. I think with the progress that we made this morning, I have a lot of the blanks filled in from what we actually wanted as far as requests. So the rest of the afternoon, I think, is maybe 2-3 hours at the most. And really what I want to address is issues unresolved from the previous sunset, new issues identified from the last sunset report, which we're kind of talking in past tense, but it's kind of confusing. And then any of the new issues, which we kind of addressed already with the exemption / AB 1000 direct access conversation. So in the materials, if you look back through the old sunset report under section 11, which was titled new issues, we had identified about 5 or 6 things at the time that the board was either struggling with or we were asking for assistance from the legislature. The first one was a lot of what I think the board members recall in conversation, a lot of the work where we were trying to create as compelling of an argument as possible that we really did need a lot of help and assistance from the legislature when it came to staffing issues and lack of financial resources. So I'm happy to say now those things have resolved themselves over the last 5 or 6 years. Again, we have mild growing pains. We do have some need for additional staffing, but not out of the ordinary, right? And we have additional rationale to address those things in the future. Fiscally, with the last fee increase, again, our fund condition is much healthier, and so that's not as much of an issue. We went so far in the last sunset is to kind of identify each and every unit in the program and why we felt like it was deficient and what we wanted to see as an outcome or a solution to that deficiency. And all of those things have kind of bared out over time over the last 6 years. So we are going to have to provide narrative to that in explanation to the legislature here in this report. As part of the final draft. And so you'll see one incremental step at the November meeting, and then again, hopefully that final draft when we get to the December meeting.
Hi, Jason. Sorry to interrupt. I was here at 1:30. I just was having a hard time unmuting my mic.
Okay, we'll put you on the record. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. I thought that might be the case. We've already kind of addressed issue number 2 because that's updating the fee statute, and we have homework and research to kind of take away. Staff's going to look at the recommendations of the board and do some statistical comparison across the United States and across professions in California. And so we'll bring that data back for you too.
Are you looking at a certain page?
So in the old sunset report.
The old sunset report.
So in the current agenda materials under the briefing paper, there were 2 hyperlinks.
Yeah.
That first hyperlink will take you to the old sunset report right off of our website.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Thank you.
And I'm on page 94 at this point of that document.
And where are the hyperlinks?
In the briefing paper.
Oh, the briefing paper, sorry. Okay. Yes.
Okay. So issue number 2 was to kind of give you some history and background, take you back in time with the Wayback Machine. We had issues with retired status. We had an existing authority for retired status that was a little left wanting. We entered into a regulatory package to kind of clarify it better. And lo and behold, while we were doing our regulatory package, the legislature wrote a retirement statute for all of the Department of Consumer Affairs that had all of the bells and whistles that we wanted. So in that clarifying revisions to the retired license status, we will provide that kind of history and background. And as you all know, that regulatory package is pending now, and we're getting close to conclusion. So, hopefully that's something that we can report back to the legislature that has essentially been completed or is about to be completed. Issue number 3 were technical corrections to a cross-reference, and this had to go back to SB 198 when we had the revisions to the Practice Act themselves, and we had a few technical errors of authority citations, and those were fixed as part of the 2016 Sunset Bill as well. Issue number 4 was a big one, and the board members had a lot of conversation about, because we had implemented the TOEFL examination for foreign trained applicants, but we realized that there were some exemption requirements that we wanted for English educated or English speaking students, and be able to provide them an exemption from that exam. As a result of that bill, we were provided with those exemptions. And so that also is something that has been resolved since the last sunset. And then issue number 5, which we kind of alluded to earlier in the conversation, was the treatment plan of care for children covered under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Essentially the issue that PTs in an educational setting were running into issues of not having an actual diagnosis to work from. And they were actually using the AB 1000 indirect access statute kind of, not for its intended purposes, but they didn't have much choice. And so we did get clarity from that bill in the 2016 Sunset Bill that addressed those issues as well, gave them some clarifying language that they could get. They could base their treatment based off of an evaluation from somebody on the team, the healthcare team. Those are the remnants of what's left over of the 2016 bill, or the 2016 Sunset Bill itself. And so the ones that are gone that we no longer have responsibility for, we don't have to provide an explanation for. The ones that are ongoing, that have now come to fruition, a solution, favorable outcome, whatever you'd like to call it, we're going to have to provide a narrative explaining the hows and whys. Past that, the next big topic really is, what are the new issues that we want to address with the legislature as far as, pending wants, nice to haves, those kind of things. We addressed the direct access idea, so we have that. There is another one that staff has asked the board may consider. Our ability to meet today and our ability to meet in the past year and a half was hinged off of a governor's executive order that allowed us to stray from the Administrative Procedures Act. We did not have to have the old-fashioned teleconference where we had to notice, each and every member's public location and have it publicly accessible and do those kind of things. And the only way we were able to do that in the past was because of the governor's executive order. That governor's executive order expired on September 30th. A piece of legislation was passed just prior to that, very similar to the executive order, that allows us to continue to do these types of WebEx meetings, but it expires in January of 2022, which, if you think about it, is right around the corner. So we're up in the air a little bit past January 22 of what we think in-person or non-in-person meetings look like. I'm sure that there is going to be another legislative solution proposed to amend the Administrative Procedures Act in California to allow for the modernization of technology and WebEx and Zoom and Teams meetings and those kind of things. But having said that, I don't know what that is. I don't know when it will come. I don't know what shape or form. So one of the things the board could do is ask the legislature in support of that idea is in your Practice Act, you have a mandate of meetings, right? You have to meet 3 times a year, once in Northern California, once in Southern California. It is an idea to include in that mandate that we provide a WebEx platform for those meetings. Not in lieu of meeting in person, but in addition to meeting in person. And then when we need to have a WebEx meeting, we can. So if we happen to be in Southern California at a school program where we're all in the same room and we're all meeting together, we're fine. But we're also providing a WebEx portion of that so that consumers, stakeholders can still participate at a remote level and still come to the meeting in person if they'd like. So we're extending access. We're not limiting it in one way or another. And And that would allow us to do that here in Sacramento for our other two meetings as well. And so I think it provides greater flexibility for staff, greater flexibility for board members, but more importantly, greater flexibility for the stakeholders, for the consumers. It's nice, right? We should get out and rub elbows with our stakeholders. We should go to programs in Southern California. We should go to programs in the Bay Area. When we do that, essentially we kind of isolate people geographically. If we're in Southern California, it's very difficult for somebody from Northern California to participate in the board meeting itself. And with this WebEx functionality, if we added it as a requirement, we could actually allow them to participate regardless of where we are. Now, what that looks like, I don't know. And it's kind of a new idea. Like I said, I think there will be some statutory change that comes that allows for these things, but us recommending it as part of our sunset process, and even the recommendation of including it in our statutory mandate, is just in favor of that argument, right? It's just in support of the idea of we need to modernize the APA. And it could give us a possible solution until that further legislative solution comes. Right now, we don't know when or how. I think that there's something to consider about the way the legislature extended it with a deadline of January of 2022. I think their intent is that we still get out into the public, right? They don't want WebEx to replace in-person meetings. And their expressed intent through that legislative language, I think, speaks that. So I'm hoping that the members might want to discuss that, or at least provide me a little feedback on what they think about that idea.
Do you have any anticipated pushback?
She took my question.
Thank you, Tanya.
I do. I actually think there will be, but I'll tell you, I think it's going to be because what I'm recommending is going to be misconstrued at first, right? So when I say that I think we should switch to WebExes, I think they're going to think WebEx and WebEx only, right? When I'm saying it's not in lieu of, it's in addition to. Like, we're still going to adhere to our mandates to travel to Southern California. We're still going to adhere to our mandates to travel to the Bay Area. We're just adding this as an additional source of access for the public to participate.
And we've all seen how the WebEx has done that.
I have the ability in WebEx to go back and see who's participated. In fact, Sarah Conley and her staff have routinely gone back through, identified who the physical therapists were, and mailed them certificates for attending the board meeting. I mean, it's a way for me to acknowledge in their engagement, which is the whole purpose of that section of the continuing competency requirement. We weren't really able to enforce that when it was even in person. We would put little postcards in the back of the room, and sometimes people would pick them up and sometimes people wouldn't. And now it's just a little bit easier to kind of keep track of that. But also just that very ease of turning on a laptop or a cell phone or an iPad and giving them that window of access where it's not just a webcast where they watch you guys doing your business. When you ask for public comment and a facilitator comes on and says, if you have public comment, please, type that in the chat. They now have an opportunity to engage firsthand. And they didn't have that before. So I think it's a win-win, but the pushback, I think, will be that they think that they might misconstrue it. And the reason I say that is because I've had these conversations with peers, and I know they didn't understand it right as I was explaining it.
Yeah.
This is Daniel.
Board member? Yep.
So my understanding of what's being proposed is something that probably doesn't require legislative action. What we're looking at is just expanding we're adding another opportunity for people to be involved. We're still keeping the meetings the way that we have them set, that we'll have 4 in-person meetings. In addition to the webcast, we're offering a live interactive capacity. So I don't know that that necessarily requires any modification, except that we're adding the same way that we added webcast so that people could watch live if they wanted to. We're just adding the option to be able to watch and then interact via WebEx, right?
Partly, right?
Okay.
So,
Well,
correct in the sense that the 4 existing meetings that we have now, we could add this functionality to easily, right?
Right.
We could do it. We don't need any help with legislation or anything like that.
right.
But in doing so, if we added it to legislation and you had meetings that would normally be considered teleconferences, right, in between, like those special types of meetings,
Right.
We would now still be able to, because of the inclusion of that language, be able to do that using this methodology and not have to step back to that antiquated delivery method of Daniel sitting at the living room in his home and having to maybe public notice where you're at and providing access by going down to a public park or a coffee shop and letting people chime in on your call.
Right.
Right. So this is in addition to allow for the flexibility to not have to get stuck in the old teleconference. And that, I think, would require the statutory change.
Right. And so it would, in my mind, it would really only be about that special meeting, those specially called meetings where we do have to have, where we have to tie to the old language of the teleconference and that kind of thing. So it would be those meetings where it's the issue, where the challenge is right now that we're actually limiting participation by having people who just can't call in. I mean, if anything, that's the old language is being way more restrictive because people have to be able to travel. That there's no opportunity for them to be able to call in from where they are.
Admittedly, it is a bit of a kind of a manipulation, right? Because what I'm trying to do is, while I want to add it as functionality to our existing authority, it overrides. And so essentially any board meeting, what I'm proposing is any board meeting that we hold would have to have a WebEx component. And whether you're in Sacramento or whether you're in Southern California, it would be there. And if that's the case, you no longer have to differentiate between a normal meeting and a teleconference meeting. So teleconference becomes a thing of the past for us, which for me, admittedly, I think, one, I would want to encourage the engagement of stakeholders, right? I want to provide that access. And Daniel's right, we could add it to our existing board meetings, but if there's a board meeting where maybe a few members have to do it from home and a few members can come in, that turns into a teleconference meeting, right? If I provide the WebEx functionality and require it as a mandate in the Practice Act, we could avoid the WebEx. And the language would have to be specific enough to have that outcome, but that's the intent.
And is the language something that's specific to our Practice Act, or is it something that is overarching for all board meetings throughout DCA?
I think it's something that should be overarching for all board meetings, but we don't have that jurisdiction, right? So absent of whatever that legislative remedy is going to be, subsequent to January of 2022. Like I said, I have no idea. It's inevitable that it's going to get fixed. I just don't know when. But we could be the leader in fixing it and providing, that issue. Like I said, the January 22 expiration is like a head scratcher. It's a little baffling to me. Why not just leave it in place? Because we've all seen it improves engagement, improves access to the public. But I think the other thing that's kind of a point of confusion is that there's this impression that boards will just stay home, right? Members will stay home in their homes and they won't provide public meeting access points for people to physically show up to a location. We've heard that boards, have found cost savings in the ability to provide this kind of access through WebEx. And while that is true, the cost savings cannot be this kind of deciding factor that removes us from access to the public in a face-to-face way. But it could help.
Oh, no, I mean, just also argue that an in-person meeting for this board in particular is just a very desirable thing. We are adjusting to being virtual. We're adjusting to jumping in and commenting. I think we're doing the best we can. This meeting's been going well. But it's not the same as being face-to-face. It's not the same as the interaction that happens organically between the members and the public face-to-face. So that's not the case for this board, certainly, that we would want to revert to all WebEx just because we have the capability. Yeah.
It was our intent to kind of try this as a dry run at this meeting, right? We were trying to do this as a travel meeting where we brought all the board members to Sacramento. It's a working meeting for Sunset. It's kind of a great environment to do this in, and then also as a layer on top of that, provide the WebEx access so that stakeholders could watch in and provide input if they needed to. COVID is what it is. Travel is what it is, and it's really difficult to set up some of the logistics right now. It's almost like the world's not ready to travel just yet. But it would have been a very clear example of how this could be applied and how the advantage in future meetings would be, right now you have 7 members and, let's just say one of them, can't travel to California. Well, if they can't travel to California using the old authority, they can't participate. And what I'm proposing is with that WebEx functionality, I could have 3 or 4 members present physically and maybe 3 or 4 members present remotely, but not have to also include access to their, not have them have to travel to a public library that's publicly accessible and post the signs on the doors and make sure that, the public can come sit with Dr. Dominguez or Dr. Armstrong to participate. They can use the WebEx functionality. This technology works really well. It actually encourages that engagement much more so than the old teleconference model ever did.
I would even argue that some board members may be able to participate remotely versus not participate at all.
Right, that's it, exactly.
Yeah. I do have a question. I know that we're on WebEx now. I hear that we're also doing webcast.
Yes.
Can you please explain the difference?
So WebEx is available to everyone, right? In the materials, we provide the directions for them to log into the WebEx as an attendee. And then when you do your open to public comment, they can raise their hand, provide public comment, and engage, and use the WebEx portal for that. Webcast is a second level of access where maybe I do have someone who, a couple different things, might not have the technical wherewithal or even the equipment to participate in the WebEx, but they can watch the webcast. Right?
I do need both.
It doesn't hurt to have both, is the way I see it. You don't need to have both. Some other boards, if they're doing a WebEx, don't see the benefit of also having a webcast. It's almost redundant. Redundancy is not that bad of a thing, right? In the event that somebody has issues logging into the WebEx, at least webcast can be a backup for them. Or they don't want to go through the whole, installation of Cisco's WebEx software, that kind of thing. They can just visit a website and watch the old-fashioned webcast. While we've opened the door of access using WebEx, because we've always provided the webcast service, I just decided to keep it. Like, instead of closing that door of access, there's quite a number of people who rely on it. So we'll just let them continue to do so. We've encouraged them to come onto the WebEx platform and, participate. So.
Thank you for that.
In furtherance of that discussion, staff and I can kind of sit down with council and kind of brainstorm what would that language look like?
Yeah.
You know, and if that helps in the conversation, we're more than willing to do that as well.
Any board member feel one way or the other about including this issue and pursuing this issue?
This is Jesus. So I agree with everything. So those of us in the academic PT world, we're pretty used to this in-person model with the webcam video WebEx option as a supplement to improve access, not and I think it really comes down to perception, right? As if this language is woven in, I think the pessimistic perception would be that, well, everybody's just going to stay home and, to Jason's point, not rub elbows, which I think that's all we can do right now until we're over this pandemic, is do elbow bumps. And that's sort of the same conversation we've had in the academic PT world, is this perception that, well, everybody's just going to stay home, and we're missing that face-to-face interaction that, for as long as I've been on the board, I think is very valuable. I think we all appreciate that. So, if it takes a legislative, route to do that, I'm totally in favor of it. And Daniel made the great point. I guess we don't necessarily have to do it, but Jason's point about the teleconference, if this gets us around the potentially negative perception of everybody's just going to stay at home, and if people can understand that this is just an improvement in access for all stakeholders. And I'll tell you, from the academic perspective, a DPT student is more likely to type in the chat a question and actually participate than if they are sort of having a little stage fright. But again, that's more, I think, the student population. But I'm just curious to see if more folks, stakeholders at home or members of the public would engage a little more if we also had this as an option for their access. So I know that was a very long statement to a very short point. Like, yeah, I'd be in favor of using this as an extension of accessibility, not a replacement for in-person meetings.
I have a quick question, Jason. So you have the capability now to see who joins the meetings. Are you able to see how long they stay?
Funny enough, we are, right? So the attendance logs that we receive subsequent to the meeting have, for the WebEx, not for the webcast. That's the other option about webcast. It would be very difficult for me to prove to someone for continuing competency purposes, like a licensee attending, if they use the webcast. And I would argue that there's no engagement in the webcast. So I'll give credit for the WebEx, right? But we can look at those attendance modules and we can see when they logged in, when they logged out, when they logged back in, when they logged back out. And there's even this kind of nifty statistic that WebEx provides about engagement, and I don't know where it comes from. I don't know if they are looking at maybe what the person is doing on the other end of the laptop. They're logged in and they're watching an episode of their favorite show while this is playing in the background. But there's actually a calculation of engagement, and like I said, I don't know the algorithm or how it works, but it kind of tells me the difference between somebody who just logged in and walked away and somebody who logged in and actually was engaged or paid attention. And I don't know how, but it's an interesting statistic.
They do that for board members too.
I know.
We're in trouble.
The other thing I wanted to add to the conversation too was this is just something that staff is bringing to the board as a potential idea to start a conversation with the legislature. It may not bear anything out, but at least we've engaged them and given them our feedback and the ideas, and maybe that's what spurs whatever that legislative remedy is in the future. Because right now, honestly, the expiration of January of 2022 just has me in dread because I don't know the state of the world today. I mean, a global pandemic that's winding down does not seem to be winding down. And so our March meeting, right now is in person. Is it? And if it's not, are we doing it the old teleconference way? Because I'm not a fan. Not a fan of the old method.
What do you think, Katarina or Dale? Any thoughts on moving forward on this issue?
I agree.
This is Kat. Oh, sorry, Dale. You go ahead.
I agree with adding. I think that adding the option is good language and also does increase access to the public.
This is Kat. It would seem like a step backward if we didn't extend this. So yes, I agree.
It's actually a good way to put it. That's a good way to put it.
We've all had headaches with the teleconference in the past, right? We've experienced them ourselves. But I don't think anybody realized how antiquated that language was until after the governor put in the order exempting us from the APTA standards and allowing us to meet the way we're meeting today.
Yeah.
Could we go back? That's the question is, could we go back and even be effective?
Okay. I think we should probably, if there's any more board discussion, please jump in. And if not, I will open it up to public comment. So let's just pause for about 10 seconds and see if there's more board discussion or staff comment. Moderator, will you please facilitate any public comment on this issue?
At the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access that Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, this is the moderator. It appears there are no requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. Mr. Kaiser.
So I've exhausted the ideas that staff have come up with, right? So now it's really just an opportunity for the members, to come recommending the kind of things that they think or have always thought should be addressed. If there's something that you want us to identify as an issue for legislative change, I mean, this is certainly the vehicle. So.
I'll start. I have an idea, but it's just an idea. Is there anything in the realm of continuing competency that we might want to look at or add to? I guess I'm thinking specifically, is it worth trying to make like the alternative pathway a little more clear or broaden it to include other things?
There's certainly room to do that. I don't necessarily think that we need sunset to do it. Right? Okay. So the alternate pathways and all of the requirements that were kind of if we have any issue with, those are in regulation.
Yeah.
And so we can specify those through regulatory change. The alternate pathways is a good example. They are written from the statutory authority of having a continuing education program, a continuing competency program. The only thing that's in the continuing competency statute that would have any kind of significant change is whether or not the board ever felt an examination of competency was ever appropriate. Right? So a typical continuing competency model has a frequent demonstration of competency. When this board was granted the authority from the legislature, we were expressly prohibited from requiring it. They could voluntarily do it and get credit for it, but it's not something that we could make their license renewal contingent upon, right? So they don't have to take an MPTE exam or a California law exam or anything equivalent of. They could take the California law exam and get credit for it, but we couldn't require it. So that's really in change statutorily, that's really the only significant thing that's there. In fact, in statute, we actually have the authority to collect fees from either licensees, content creators, or approval agencies. So even if we wanted to implement a fee, we would have to do that in regulation. We have the statutory authority, we just haven't put it into regulation yet. So some of the issues that we have with continuing competency could be remedied at that regulatory level quite easily.
Perfect. Other thoughts from our members?
Alicia, this is Jesus. So something you said, actually, the continued competency, and then Jason talking about, demonstration. So, for example, we don't require the NPTE or the California law exam, but individuals could take the CLE and get credit for it. And I just remembered, this has been a while ago. I had a colleague who's practicing asked me if they could take the CLE as in satisfaction of the ethics. And I said, I think so. And then they said, well, so this was hypothetical. This individual graduated, decades back, successfully passed it back then. Is there a double jeopardy deal here where if they did not pass the CLE this go, does that somehow retroactively put their license in jeopardy? Completely hypothetical, sir.
I understand the hypothetical. I've never considered it before, but I could see the hesitation that some people might have. I've actually heard it expressed in other realms, right, where that's one of the reasons why a competency exam is kind of frowned upon, because they vary, especially when it comes to education that's changed over time and the licensure requirements that have changed over time. If one of my licensees takes the California law exam today, with the idea of applying it to their continuing competency regulation or requirement, and they fail, there's no detriment to their licensure, right? They're not going to get any credit towards their continuing competency, obviously. But no, there's no double jeopardy applied here. There's no issue. Hopefully they try it again, study up a little bit, and get those hours towards the requirements. One of the points of confusion that we have had in the past is, can they take the California law exam in lieu of the 2 hours of ethics and logs? And unfortunately, the way the statutes and the laws are written, that's not the intent. And no, they cannot, right? They can get credit for taking the California law exam, but not towards those 2 hours for ethics and laws.
Thank you, sir. I'll certainly pass that along.
And that last statement you made, that is in statute.
Correct. So the way that, because there's two things that really issue with the way those statutes are written. The alternate pathway had an intent at the time. And really the only example was if you had a physical therapist assistant licensed who was also trying to duly license as a PT. As part of their PT application, they're going to take the NPTE and the California law exam. And in taking that California law exam, could they use that to suffice their requirement at their PTA level? And yeah, they could for hours. And the actual alternate pathway says how many hours that's worth. The statute for ethics and laws is standalone, and it stands with the same requirement for 4 hours of basic life support for a healthcare provider. The intent really was for them to go and, find something that is either physical therapy service related or patient-client relationship related, whether that is Medicare billing or, laws and ethics as they pertain to physical therapy services, not necessarily Practice Act. It could be insurance codes. It could be, it's much more flexible, but it's not an examination. And then just as a shameful plug, the continuing competency regulations in California are great. I mean, when you talk about flexibility and what's provided, what licensees can actually get credit for, that alternate pathways list is not utilized as well as it probably could be. But you don't actually have those options in some other states either. So.
I like the plug. Other ideas from members? So Jason, between now and our next meeting, if we were to come up with any ideas, is it kind of getting late in the game to address them?
Yeah, but I don't want to close that door either. Right? So if the member has an epiphany or something that just stands out, bring it to the next meeting. Tell me in advance. Let me know outside of this meeting so I can at least kind of troubleshoot through it and see how it works. And then if that's the case, we'll bring it to the November meeting, to the rest of the members and see what we think. A little bit of the expectation is, the report is due to the legislature on January 5th. The reason I'd like to kind of close out at the December meeting is that gives us some time to take that report, send it over to DCA's PD&E group, beautify it, turn it into a really well-published document. We do have to provide 4 copies, physical copies, to both sides, the Assembly and the Senate. And I think that gives us enough time without really having to rush too, right? The members who participated in the last sunset probably remember, the meetings that we had towards as sunset approached, we started kind of stacking in more and more meetings because there was that much more to do. There's a potential that we try to put another meeting in December, if it need be. I'm trying to avoid that, and I don't know that we have as much kind of requests for service from the legislature this time around as we did back then. I think we're in pretty good shape health-wise, Practice Act-wise. There may be some things that the legislature has in mind for us that we don't know yet. The only differences in the questionnaire are really topical and timely. What did the board do during COVID-19? And we'll bring language to the table at the next meeting with the help of the committee. And there's some, recent changes in legislation like 2138 with the collection of information about, applicants with criminal history and whether or not the board is disciplined or denied those folks. And again, we'll bring that language forward in statistical information, but you've seen that in our board materials also. And then, you know, it's not my previous EO's sunset anymore. The process itself has kind of changed. I mean, its purpose is a little bit different. So I was trying to quote a Buick commercial. I guess that's an Oldsmobile. Never mind.
Okay, so I know you don't want us necessarily to start really digging, but if we have something that comes to mind, we can bring it to you.
Please do.
You can kind of mull it over and kick it around a little. But do you have any advice for the members between now and our next meeting?
Members in general, yeah, you know, try to kind of familiarize yourself with the old sunset report. Because I think that's, you know, as staff went back and kind of reviewed the sunset report, we kind of realized a lot of its content is the same. We're just essentially kind of tacking on history to the end of the last report. And then we have that kind of statistical data that we're always reporting through board meetings anyway. We're just doing it for a different audience this time with the legislature. But so, you know, familiarize yourself with the old sunset report and, you know, keeping in mind that we're not reinventing the wheel. We're just kind of writing at this point, for me, a fourth edition of the sunset report.
And so, board members, I'll give one more call for any ideas for sunset issues, and then I will open it up to public comment. So please feel free to unmute.
Have an idea right now. However, I'm wondering if there's been any feedback from the PT community in California in the last 5 years since the last sunset report regarding suggested changes in continuing competency or of anything in the PT practice act.
I think that's something, I mean, we receive feedback kind of on a daily basis from stakeholders about, you know, practice act issues and those kind of things. Some of the things I think are very appropriate for us to consider. The ministerial kind of things like retired status for licensees and the continuing competency requirements and those kind of things. There are some more general, almost, you know, advocacy for the profession ideas that get presented to us. I often get asked questions like, you know, what is the board doing about advancing the profession in the state of California? Or what is the board doing about PT pay in private practice, or, you know, those kind of things, which are really more association-driven issues. The intended beneficiary of those conversations are the licensees themselves. And so when that's the case, those are appropriate for the association. The things that we should be considering here is when the beneficiary is the consumer, the receiver of physical therapy services. So, and sometimes those are synonymous, right? I mean, we kind of touched on AB 1000 and direct access, and whether or not the removal of this requirement would actually increase care, would increase the ability for physical therapy to be provided in remote locations, in situations where, you know, a physician or a surgeon is not available to do either a telehealth or an in-person meeting. So it's one of those things where I still think it's appropriate, but sometimes the questions that we're asked to advocate for are a little bit out of our perspective.
Jason, this is Jesus. To that point, you know, the board has heard through the years several presentations on things like dry needling, animal rehab, and I've always wondered where do those go? We sort of, you know, have these things presented to us, and although we can't, you know, they just sort of, you know, they escape my my radar.
They don't ever escape mine. So I would expect in this next legislative session that we will be presented with animal rehab once again. And that one's difficult for me to kind of even chime in on because I don't have, my stakeholder is really not involved in the equation, right? My stakeholder is the human consumer of physical therapy services, and animal rehab really doesn't involve them at all. So, but it doesn't mean that they're not going to invite us into the conversation or already have. And so it's also an older problem, right? It's funny how Dr. Dominguez framed it, like where do those problems go? Well, they never go away. They're always here. They've been here for a long time, and they're pretty, highly contested conversations. So solutions have not been found thus far. Dry needling is also kind of one of those things where it could be a very beneficial modality, to physical therapy consumers. We really kind of have to look at that and try to determine whether it's appropriate for the regulatory board to bring that forward, or is that something the profession should do? And I will leave that to you as board members to kind of figure out. I know that, trends and legislative change in other states often, kind of ripple across the United States. So kind of similar to direct access that we talked about, other states have certain laws in place. As dry needling becomes more prevalent, the pressure will get applied by the licensing population and the consumers of physical therapy services. And ultimately that conversation will bubble up to the legislative level and it will create some kind of change. We'll just have to see what that is. I think the same thing goes for animal rehab. But when I bring them to the board's attention, it's because there's some kind of consumer-based point of contention. The example would be dry needling. When we brought dry needling to the board, there was this kind of misinformation that there were, physical therapists in California all over doing dry needling modalities, when really the reality was we've had, less than a handful of legitimate complaints, and all of the other ones are actually practicing on some kind of military base or in a VA hospital under the auspices of the federal government, which is out of our jurisdiction. And so we just wanted to kind of tamp that controversy down and bring clarity to that kind of false narrative.
And Dale, I think your question was a good question, and I'm sure the CPTA is working on, looking at the Practice Act, and they'll be in touch with us when time comes and they find something, to bring to our attention. So.
As I understand it, they've actually put together a committee to modernize the Practice Act, and we've had communication and conversation with Rick Katz, the chair, and Stacy Defoe, their administrator. So there are conversations happening at the association level to kind of look at those things.
Thank you for that background.
No problem.
I have a question about staff. Does the sunset process, gosh, I can't remember clearly from last time. Do we include requests for staff in the sunset process? Is that through ABD or?
We did express our needs and requests for staff in the last sunset report because we were in kind of these, very dire need. And if you kind of remember, the time was there was essentially a hiring freeze in the state of California. So when it was necessary for us to grow, we had really bad timing because we were prohibited from growing.
Right.
And so we had to take and escalate that and identify it as a sunset issue. We're in a situation now, and that situation in the previous sunset was compounded by the fact that we didn't have enough monies to support any of those kind of requests. Today, we've been very successful through the BCP process is because, again, the math is very compelling. We can show here's the need, here's the daily work that comes through, and here's how much time it takes each analyst, how many analysts are appropriate for that position. And we happen to have the money to pay for those positions. And so we're right in alignment, and that process works for us very well right now. I don't have any recommendation for any particular unit to identify it at a sunset level for this time around.
Great, thank you.
And I'm happy to say that. Like, that's a good position to be in.
It is a good position to be in. Other board member comments, questions, issues? Anybody doing this, like getting ready to push and not push unmute? Everybody good? Okay. All right, so moderator, can you please facilitate public comment for this issue if there's any other issues or questions or concerns?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, it appears there are no requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please, thank you. So Jason, we're complete with agenda item 5 and 6?
We are. I have everything that I need to move forward and work with the committee and bring quite a bit of product back to you guys for November.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to finish on down the agenda here. And agenda item number 7 is, again, public comment on items not on the agenda. So moderator, if you could please facilitate comment for items not on the agenda.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment for items not on the agenda, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. This is the moderator. It appears there are no requests for public comment. Would you like me to close the Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. Okay, agenda item number 8 is agenda items for future meetings, which is December 9th through 10th. Right now, it is December 9th through 10th. But any items from board members?
I just have one thing to say about the December meeting. So we do have some normally scheduled items for the December meeting, and just kind of keeping in mind, depending on how much progress we actually make with the committee and then the November meeting, as we get closer to the December 9th, 10th, I might make some agenda changes and request the board president to approve them and say, some of these things can be delayed, maybe a couple months, as far as, presentation of services from the Department of Justice or something like that, so that we have more time to complete the sunset.
Yeah, okay. Good. How about in December, you'll probably do this anyway, but just kind of let us know if there's any updates on the jam.
Yeah. I guess the other thing for us to keep in mind too is as soon as we're done with the sunset, we're going to turn around and do the strategic plan again.
Yeah, next year. 2022. already here. Any other board member ideas for our next meeting or even future meetings? Anything you want to hear about, talk about, possibly take action on? Okay. So, moderator, can you please facilitate comment from the public on any items for future meetings?
This is a moderator, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, this is the moderator. It appears there are no requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you so much. And we have already tackled agenda item 9, which is closed session. So agenda item 10 is adjournment. Before I do, I just want to again thank Tanya and Jesus for volunteering for our Sunset Committee. And just know that your fellow board members support you, and we've got your back if you need help. So we can't wait to see what you have available for us to learn in November. Thank you both.
Go hall, woo, woo, woo.
No. All right, sounds good. Okay, nice to see you guys on WebEx. Take good care, and we're adjourning at 2:34.